Black woman billionaire was kicked out of her VIP seat. To make room, everyone silent after her call. It was supposed to be an uneventful flight for Ava Johnson, a successful black entrepreneur. As she boarded the plane and settled into her VIP seat, 2A, she was already thinking ahead to her next big meeting. The soft hum of the engines and the muted bustle of the first-class cabin created a calm atmosphere. Ava, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, exuded confidence and composure, a reflection of her hard-earned success. Moments after taking her seat, the air shifted. A middle-aged white woman, Lydia Carter, stepped into the cabin with an air of entitlement that demanded attention. Her sharp gaze landed on Ava, and her demeanor stiffened. Without hesitation, Lydia approached the flight crew, her voice tinged with indignation as she insisted there must have been a mistake. "I'm supposed to be in seat 2A, she declared loudly, her words cutting through the polite quiet of the cabin. The flight attendant, visibly uncomfortable, turned to Ava. "Miss Johnson," he began hesitantly, "would you mind moving to another seat? It would make things easier." Ava's calm demeanor never wavered. She looked directly at the flight attendant, her voice steady and unwavering. "I paid for this seat. I reserved it. Why should I move?" The tension in the cabin was palpable. Other passengers, who had previously been engrossed in their magazines and devices, now watched the unfolding drama with silent curiosity. Ava, however, remained composed. She didn't raise her voice or react with anger. Instead, she reached for her phone, made a single call, and leaned back in her seat with quiet resolve. What happened next would not only change the course of the flight, but spark a ripple effect that no one on board could have anticipated. Ava Johnson's story is one of grit, resilience, and determination. Born and raised in a small town in Georgia, Ava grew up in a modest household with big dreams. Her mother worked long hours as a nurse, while her father ran a small auto repair shop. From an early age, Ava learned the value of hard work and perseverance, often hearing her parents say, "You don't let the world decide your worth, you show them." Despite the odds stacked against her, Ava excelled academically. She earned a scholarship to a prestigious university where she studied business administration. But her path wasn't without challenges. She often found herself as one of the few black students in her classes, navigating the unspoken biases and subtle dismissals that came with breaking into spaces where she wasn't accepted to belong. Instead of shrinking in the face of adversity, Ava thrived, graduating at the top of her class and earning a reputation as someone who could turn obstacles into opportunities. After graduation, Ava entered the corporate world where she quickly made her mark. But climbing the ladder wasn't easy. She faced countless moments of microaggressions and outright prejudice, from being mistaken for an assistant in meetings to being passed over for opportunities she was more than qualified for. Still, she kept pushing forward, knowing she was carving a path for those who would come after her. Her breakthrough came when she founded her own consulting firm. Starting with just a laptop, a small office, and a relentless work ethic, Ava grew her business into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Her firm specialized in helping minority-owned businesses scale and succeed, a mission close to her heart. Her success didn't just elevate her, it created opportunities for others, making her a force for change in her community. By the time Ava stepped onto that flight, she was no stranger to the silent judgments and quiet resistance that came with her success. She had worked tirelessly to reach the point where a first-class seat wasn't just a luxury, it was a symbol of her hard-earned place in a world that had often told her she didn't belong. But Ava wasn't defined by those moments of discrimination. She was defined by how she responded to them, with grace, strength, and an unshakable belief in her worth. This was the woman who calmly took her seat in 2A, prepared to defend her right to be there, not just for herself, but for every other person who had ever been made to feel they didn't belong. And when the confrontation with Lydia Carter began, Ava was ready. Not because she sought conflict, but because she knew that sometimes standing your ground was the most powerful statement you could make. As Ava Johnson sat quietly in the lounge, awaiting her flight, she couldn't help but reflect on the subtle undercurrents that often accompanied her presence in elite spaces. These weren't moments of outright hostility, those were rare and easily identifiable. Instead, it was the whispers, as she had come to call them, the almost imperceptible cues that signaled she didn't belong, at least in the eyes of others. She had felt it when the lounge attendant's smile faltered as they scanned her first-class ticket, the hesitation just long enough to convey disbelief. It was in the side glances from other travelers, who seemed to measure her worth with their eyes before looking away. Ava had learned to carry these moments with quiet strength, knowing they reflected the biases of others, not her value. Her thoughts were interrupted by a figure entering the room, Clara Whitman. Clara wasn't a woman you could ignore. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being noticed and obeyed. Her platinum hair was styled immaculately, and her outfit designed from head to toe spoke of wealth and privilege, the kind that came not from hard work, but from inheritance. Everything about her seemed cultivated, down to the delicate way she clasped the handle of her expensive leather tote. As Clara scanned the room, her eyes briefly met Ava's. The glance wasn't hostile, but it wasn't neutral either. It lingered just long enough to convey quiet judgment, as if Ava's very presence was a question she couldn't reconcile. Ava had seen that look before, the kind that categorized people, determined their worth, and decided whether they were a disruption or an asset. Ava held Clara's gaze, her face unreadable, her posture composed. She didn't need to say anything. Her very existence in this space was the statement. Clara looked away first, but the subtle tension remained. It was in moments like these that Ava was reminded of the 1,000 little ways the world tried to push people like her to the margins. Ava held out her hands, forcing Clara to give hers. When boarding began, Ava noticed Clara again, this time in line for first class. Clara's presence seemed to command the attention of everyone around her, not because she demanded it, but because she expected it. As they made their way onto the plane, Ava could feel Clara's presence just behind her, a silent but palpable reminder of the unspoken hierarchy Clara believed she represented. Once aboard, the whispers became louder. Ava noticed the flight attendant, Greg, linger just a moment too long as he checked her ticket, his expression unreadable, but his hesitation clear. "First class?" he asked, as though the words themselves felt out of place. Ava responded with a calm but firm yes. She was used to this kind of interaction. It was never blatant enough to warrant a complaint, but always present enough to remind her she was being scrutinized. As Ava settled into her seat, 2A Clara entered the cabin with the same air of entitlement she carried everywhere. It wasn't just her wealth. It was her assumption that spaces like these were built for her and those like her. Ava noticed the way Clara's gaze swept over the cabin, pausing momentarily on her. Clara's expression tightened, not with open hostility, but with the subtle disapproval Ava knew all too well. When Clara approached the flight crew to voice her concern, Ava wasn't surprised. She had been here before, these quiet challenges to her presence, the implication that she must have ended up here by mistake. Clara's behavior was textbook entitlement, the belief that her comfort and convenience should take precedence over everyone else's, particularly someone she viewed as an outsider. In these moments, Ava reflected on how deeply ingrained these dynamics were. It wasn't about a single person or a single incident. It was a system, one that operated so seamlessly that many didn't even recognize it. Clara Whitman wasn't just a person. She was a symbol of inherited privilege, of a world built to reinforce the comfort of some at the expense of others. But Ava had learned how to navigate these spaces with dignity and resolve. She didn't need to prove her worth to anyone, least of all to Clara. Instead, she chose to let her actions and her presence speak for themselves. As Clara's complaints escalated, Ava remained seated, calm and unbothered, a quiet defiance against the unspoken rules that tried to exclude her. In that moment, Ava realized that her presence wasn't just a personal victory. It was a challenge to a system that thrived on silence and complicity. And Ava had no intention of being silent. Ava Johnson had just settled into her seat 2A, letting out a quiet sigh of relief. It wasn't often she had the opportunity to fly first class, but today was different. She had earned this, just like everything else in her life. The soft leather of the seat and the folded blanket were small luxuries she appreciated, not because they defined her, but because they symbolized how far she'd come. As the cabin began to fill, Ava noticed Clara Whitman step into first class, exuding her signature presence of entitlement. Clara's gaze swept across the cabin before landing on Ava. The briefest flicker of irritation crossed her face, but Clara didn't say anything. Not yet. Moments later, Clara called over Greg, the flight attendant. Her voice, though calm, was loud enough to carry. "There seems to have been a mistake," she said, her tone laced with authority. "I believe I'm supposed to be in seat 2A. Greg's eyes darted toward Ava, then back to Clara. "Let me check, Mrs. Whitman," he replied, already looking flustered. He approached Ava cautiously, as though anticipating resistance. "Miss Johnson," he began hesitantly, "would you mind moving to another seat? It seems there's been a mix-up, and it would make things easier." Ava looked up at Greg, her expression calm but unyielding. "Easier for whom?" she asked, her voice steady and composed. Greg hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of her question. "It's just that Mrs. Whitman believes she's supposed to be seated here, and I paid for this seat," Ava interjected firmly. "I reserved it in advance. There's no mix-up." Clara, who had been watching the exchange from a few steps away, took it upon herself to step closer. "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding," she said, her smile thin and insincere. "But wouldn't it be simpler if you moved? I'm in first class as well. It's not like I'm asking you to go to coach." Ava turned to Clara, her gaze steady and unflinching. "Simpler for you, perhaps," she replied, "but I'm not moving." The tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers who had previously been engrossed in their devices and magazines were now openly watching the exchange. Some pretended to be unaware, their gazes flickering between Ava and Clara, while others leaned slightly forward, eager to witness the outcome. Greg shifted uncomfortably. "Miss Johnson, we'd really appreciate your cooperation. And I'd appreciate being treated with the same respect as any other first-class passenger," Ava interrupted. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried a quiet authority that made Greg pause. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm in the seat I reserved and paid for. If there's an issue, it's not mine to resolve." Clara's polite facade began to crack. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I've flown with this airline for years. I'm a loyal customer, and I expect better service than this. And I expect not to be asked to move simply because someone else is uncomfortable with my presence," Ava said sharply. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. Clara's face flushed, a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "This isn't about your presence," she said, faltering slightly. "Isn't it?" Ava countered. "Because I can't think of another reason why you believe you're entitled to my seat. Would you have made this same request if I looked like you?" The cabin fell into a tense silence. Even Greg seemed unsure of how to proceed. He glanced around as though searching for someone to intervene. Finally, a voice broke the quiet. "Why don't we just fix this and move on?" An older man in seat 3B muttered loudly, clearly irritated by the delay. Clara seized on the moment. "Exactly," she exclaimed, gesturing toward the man. "Let's resolve this so everyone can enjoy the flight." "Well," Ava turned to Clara, her expression calm but resolute. "The resolution is simple. I stay in the seat I paid for. If that makes you uncomfortable, that's not my problem to fix." Greg, looking increasingly flustered, murmured something about checking with the captain and hurried toward the front of the plane. Clara stood frozen for a moment, her jaw tight, before turning back to her seat. But even as she sat down, she continued to mutter under her breath, her words audible enough for Ava to hear. "I don't understand why this has to be so difficult." Ava ignored the whispers, the sideways glances, and the palpable discomfort that lingered in the cabin. She had no intention of letting this moment define her or her right to exist in a space she had earned. When Greg returned, his expression was carefully neutral. "Miss Johnson," he said quietly, "the captain has confirmed there's no mistake. You're welcome to remain in your seat." Ava inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without a word. Greg turned to Clara, his tone firmer now. "Mrs. Whitman, please take your assigned seat. If there are further issues, we'll have to address them formally." Clara's face flushed crimson, but she said nothing. Instead, she turned away sharply, her movements stiff and controlled. As the cabin settled back into a tense silence, Ava opened her notebook, pretending to write as a way to center herself. She knew this wasn't just about a seat. It was about belonging, dignity, and standing up to a system that often asked people like her to shrink. Ava didn't shrink. Not today. The cabin grew quiet, but it wasn't the kind of silence born from peace. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet that follows an uncomfortable truth being laid bare, the kind of silence that demanded acknowledgement but rarely received it. Ava Johnson sat in seat 2A, her shoulders squared, her notebook open in her lap. She wasn't writing, just holding the pen as if it were a lifeline, her gaze steady and unflinching. Across the aisle, Clara Whitman sat rigidly in her seat, her jaw clenched, her fingers gripping the armrest. The tension between the two women seemed to pulse, filling the air with an almost tangible weight. The other passengers, who moments ago had been absorbed in their own worlds, now found themselves involuntary witnesses to something larger. Many avoided looking directly at Ava or Clara, their gazes instead fixed on the in-flight safety cards, seatbelt buckles, or the glowing screens in front of them. Yet their discomfort was unmistakable, the way their shoulders tensed, their fingers fidgeted, their eyes darted furtively across the cabin. Silence, Ava realized, had always been a weapon. It was the unspoken agreement to look away, to not acknowledge the whispers and the stares, to pretend nothing was wrong. But in this moment, that silence felt different. It wasn't avoidance, it was reckoning. The whispers started again, low and scattered. A woman 2 rows back leaned toward her seatmate, murmuring something while casting a quick glance toward Ava. Across the aisle, an older man shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat, as though the sound might break the tension. But the silence always returned, stronger and louder than before. Ava could feel the weight of their judgment. She had felt it before, in boardrooms and business meetings, in hotels and restaurants. It was the quiet disapproval of those who believed she had overstepped, who thought she should have acquiesced to make things easier. But Ava had learned long ago that easier often meant erasing herself to preserve someone else's comfort. She wasn't going to do that today. Sarah greeted him with smiles. Clara's frustration simmered visibly. Her movements were sharp and deliberate as she adjusted her scarf and rummaged through her bag. Every action seemed calculated to draw attention, to convey her dissatisfaction without words. But Ava didn't look at her. Instead, she stared out the window, watching as the last rays of sunlight painted the horizon in gold and orange. The silence wasn't just between her and Clara, it had spread, enveloping the entire first-class cabin. It was the kind of silence that made people aware of their own complicity. No one spoke up, no one intervened, no one challenged Clara's entitlement or voiced support for Ava. Ava knew this silence all too well. It was the same silence that had greeted her when she was passed over for promotions, when clients dismissed her ideas, when colleagues laughed a little too easily at her expense. It was the silence that said, "We see what's happening, but we won't acknowledge it." Yet this time, the silence didn't intimidate her. It emboldened her. Each second that ticked by felt like a victory. The longer Ava stayed seated, the more she exposed the biases at play. She didn't need to argue or raise her voice. Her very presence in seat 2A was a statement. And the silence of the cabin, heavy as it was, spoke volumes about the power dynamics unfolding in real time. Greg, the flight attendant, passed by again, his movements stiff and awkward. His professionalism seemed strained, as though he were unsure how to navigate the situation. When his gaze briefly met Ava's, he looked away quickly, pretending to adjust something in the galley. "Please don't make a big scene about this," said Ava. The professional did not respond. Clara shifted in her seat, her face flushed. She muttered something to the woman beside her, who nodded politely but didn't respond. For the first time, Clara seemed small, her usual confidence undermined by the growing realization that no one was rallying to her side. The silence continued to thicken, pressing down on everyone in the cabin. Ava sat motionless, her expression calm but resolute. She wasn't seeking confrontation, but she wasn't avoiding it either. She had learned long ago that silence could be her ally, not the silence of complicity, but the silence of defiance. In that stillness, the dynamics began to shift. The truth, unspoken but undeniable, settled over the cabin like a heavy fog. This wasn't about a seat. It was about power, privilege, and the unyielding presence of a woman who refused to be erased. Ava didn't need to say anything else. The silence said it all. The tension in the first-class cabin reached its peak as Clara Whitman, her composure fraying, made one final attempt to assert her dominance. She turned sharply toward Greg, the flight attendant, her voice rising above the low hum of the engines. "This is unacceptable," she said, her words cutting through the silence. "I've been a loyal customer for years. How can you allow this woman to take my seat? It's disgraceful." Her tone carried the weight of entitlement, a demand for the world to bend to her will. Clara wasn't just questioning Ava Johnson's right to the seat, she was challenging Ava's right to exist in the space at all. Greg shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught between the two women. "Mrs. Whitman," he began carefully, "we've already confirmed the seat assignment. Miss Johnson is in her rightful place." Clara scoffed, her cheeks flushing with anger. "Her rightful place? You mean to tell me this airline values her loyalty over mine? After all the money I've spent? After all the years I've flown with you?" Ava finally looked up from her notebook, her pen poised, as though she'd been writing, though the page remained blank. Her gaze was calm and steady, her voice soft but unwavering. "This isn't about loyalty, Mrs. Whitman," she said. "It's about entitlement. You believe you're owed something you haven't earned, because you've been told all your life that spaces like these belong to you, but today, you're wrong." The cabin went still, the weight of Ava's words settling over everyone. Clara opened her mouth to respond, but found herself at a loss. The force of Ava's quiet truth left no room for rebuttal. A man seated nearby cleared his throat awkwardly, his gaze flicking between Ava and Clara. Another passenger shifted uncomfortably, their magazine now forgotten. The space, once filled with unspoken hierarchies and quiet complicity, began to shift under the pressure of Ava's presence. Clara's voice trembled as she spoke again, her attempts at authority slipping into desperation. "I'm not saying she doesn't belong," she stammered. "But I should be treated with respect." "Respect," Ava repeated, her voice measured and composed. "Do you know how much respect it takes to sit here quietly while someone questions my right to exist in this space? How much restraint it takes not to become the person you already believe I am?" The words struck Clara like a physical blow. Her face turned crimson, her lips parting as if to respond, but no sound came. Ava leaned back in her seat, her hands resting calmly on her lap. "The truth is, Mrs. Whitman, your comfort doesn't outweigh my dignity. You're not entitled to my silence, and you're certainly not entitled to my seat." Greg, standing nearby, shifted awkwardly before stepping forward. "Mrs. Whitman," he said firmly, "please take your assigned seat. If you refuse to comply, we'll have no choice but to escalate this matter." Clara's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're threatening me now?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "No," Ava interjected, her voice quiet but commanding. "He's enforcing the rules you thought didn't apply to you." The silence that followed was deafening. Clara's entitlement, so polished and rehearsed, had crumbled under the weight of Ava's unflinching resolve. Slowly, Clara stood, her movements stiff and jerky. Without another word, she returned to her assigned seat, her head held high, but her pride visibly wounded. There, within the atmosphere of attention, her eyes on the screen, Clara stood, placid face, authoritative. Apparently, the atmosphere in the cabin transformed. The whispers that had buzzed just moments ago were replaced by an uneasy quiet. Passengers avoided eye contact, their discomfort palpable. Yet beneath the tension was something new, an acknowledgement, however unspoken, of the injustice that had been laid bare. Ava exhaled deeply, a quiet moment of release. She knew this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, who had been asked to shrink themselves to make others more comfortable. By refusing to move, by speaking her truth with grace and dignity, Ava had reclaimed not only her space but her voice. She had forced the cabin and perhaps even Clara Whitman to confront the deeper, unspoken biases that often went unchecked. As the plane ascended into the night sky, Ava opened her notebook once more. This time she began to write, the words flowing effortlessly onto the page. For the first time in hours, she felt at ease. She wasn't just a passenger in 2A, she was a woman who had stood her ground, a reminder that dignity is not given, it is taken, held, and carried with quiet power. As the plane descended through the clouds, the cabin grew quieter still. Passengers began to gather their belongings, adjusting their bags and folding their blankets, their movements marked by an unspoken tension that lingered from the earlier confrontation. The hum of the engine softened, and the soft glow of the cabin lights framed the stillness in a surreal calm. Ava Johnson sat motionless, gazing out the window as the city lights below grew brighter, twinkling like distant stars. Her notebook rested on her lap, closed now, but the weight of her resolve felt stronger than ever. She hadn't just stayed in her seat, she had claimed her right to exist, unyielding and unapologetic. When the plane finally touched down, a ripple of movement spread through the cabin as passengers unbuckled their seatbelts and prepared to disembark. Ava didn't rush. She took her time, gathering her things with deliberate care, her every action exuding quiet confidence. Clara Whitman, seated a few rows back, stood quickly, avoiding eye contact as she made her way toward the exit. Her composure seemed intact, but Ava could see the stiffness in her movements, the unspoken defeat that followed her like a shadow. For all of Clara's privilege and entitlement, this was one battle she hadn't won. As Ava rose from her seat, a few passengers glanced her way, their expressions a mix of discomfort and quiet admiration. Some looked away quickly, still unwilling to fully engage with the truth that had unfolded before them. Others nodded suddenly, a silent acknowledgement of her strength. Ava walked down the aisle with her head held high, her steps steady and deliberate. She wasn't just walking for herself, she was walking for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, for those who had been silenced or made to feel invisible. Her presence in that moment was a quiet but profound act of defiance, a reminder that belonging isn't something the world gives you, it's something you claim for yourself. As she stepped off the plane, the cool night air greeted her like a breath of fresh resolve. She paused for a moment on the tarmac, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. She didn't need validation from the passengers behind her, or even an apology from Clara Whitman. What mattered was that she had stood her ground, unflinching in the face of bias and entitlement. The journey hadn't just been about a seat on a plane, it had been about something far greater, a declaration of self-worth, a refusal to be erased, and a testament to the strength that comes from knowing exactly who you are. Ava smiled to herself as she walked into the terminal, her steps light but her resolve heavy with purpose. She had carried herself with dignity through it all, and that, she knew, was her greatest victory. Because in the end, true belonging isn't about fitting into the spaces the world makes for you. It's about creating your own space and owning it with unapologetic confidence. And that, she thought, was something no one could ever take away. As we reflect on Ava Johnson's powerful journey, this story reminds us of the courage it takes to stand firm in the face of bias and entitlement. It's a story about more than a seat on a plane. It's about dignity, self-worth, and the silent battles many face every day to claim spaces they've earned. But this isn't just Ava's story. It's a reflection of systemic issues that persist across society. How often do we witness or experience moments like these and remain silent? How often do we let discomfort or fear prevent us from speaking up? It's time to ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want to build? One that protects comfort or one that prioritizes fairness and respect? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever faced a situation where you had to assert your right to belong? How did you handle it? Share your stories in the comments below. We want to create a space where real-life experiences are heard and valued. If Ava's story inspired you, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with friends and family who might need to hear it. Let's start a conversation about the power of resilience and the importance of standing up for what's right. And if you're moved by stories like this one, be sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Our channel, Real Life Stories, is dedicated to bringing you real, impactful narratives that inspire, challenge, and remind us of the strength of the human spirit. Thank you for watching, and remember, true belonging isn't something the world gives you, it's something you carry within yourself. Stay strong, stay kind, and we'll see you in the next story.